Good afternoon. And thank you for joining us for this session. It's a panel discussion which is titled Decarbonizing Industry. As we know, many countries in the region, among them the Kingdom of Bahrain, have adopted specific goals when it comes to carbon emissions. Bahrain unveiled its national energy strategy last year. It is a pathway to reaching the climate targets the Kingdom pledged to achieve at COP26, namely a 30% reduction in emissions by 2035 on the road to net zero emissions by 2060. Many countries in the region have set similar ambitious targets, but what is the pathway to achieving those goals? If we look at our region, households account for less than 20% of energy use. This means that transport, commerce, and manufacturing play crucial roles in decarbonization efforts to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, sorry. So what can be done to decarbonize those industries and their corresponding supply chains? And what practices and innovations are industry leaders championing? This is what we will address to our speakers. Before I introduce them, I want to mention that you will have the chance to address your questions to our speakers, so please start preparing them, and a little bit later, I will give you the chance to address your questions to them. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Jeremy Crane, Group CEO of Yellow Door Energy, Mr. Walid Sheta, Zone President for Middle East and Africa at Schneider Electric, and Mr. Bing Yuan, Co-founder and Managing Partner at Rockets Capital. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here with us today. I think before we start our conversation, why don't you take 30 seconds each to introduce to us what you do in your daily job and why it is relevant to our conversation today, decarbonizing industry. Mr. Crane.
Hi, good afternoon. Real pleasure to be here. Yellow Door invests in clean infrastructure for businesses. We've partnered with over 100 businesses across the Middle East. We've got a very strong presence in Bahrain. Lots of the panels you'll see around Bahrain were installed by our team, and those investments reduce the cost and clean the production of all of our customers.
Mr. Sheta.
So yes, thank you for having me, Nadine. Our company, Schneider Electric, is specialized in providing energy management solutions and industrial automation solutions to our customers, providing sustainability solutions for infrastructure, buildings, industries, up to residential. And our company started this journey more than 15 years ago with a complete stake of both software and hardware to provide this net zero objective.
Mr. Yuan.
Thank you. Rockets Capital is a China-focused private equity fund. We primarily invest in electric vehicle, EV supply chain, as well as new energy sectors. Our anchor investor is a Chinese EV company called XPeng. They already started selling in UAE. They are coming to Bahrain very soon. So we're very excited about the prospect for EVs in this region. As you just mentioned, transport is one of the three major areas for global carbon emissions. I think they accounted for more than 20% of carbon emissions around the world. So how to cut transport-related carbon is very close to us. You know, flying from Beijing, we live in smog and pollutions for many years. So having more EVs on the street definitely cuts down carbon emissions in major cities, but that's an interim solution. I think longer term, we need to have all EVs generated by renewable energy.
We will discuss all of that. Mr. Crane, let me start with you. Today, I mentioned that all of the countries of the region have net zero targets. If we look at the top-down approach, what policy frameworks need to be in place to help decarbonization, but at the same time maintain competitiveness of the economies?
Well, that's a great question. I think those two words, competitiveness, maybe I'll put first, and secondly, regulations or enablement. So by switching to clean energy, specifically solar, businesses can reduce cost. Solar is the lowest cost energy during the daytime, period. Generating solar on-site, on-premise, reduce the cost of transmission. That is how we make our businesses the most competitive they can be on a global basis. So what regulations do we need for that? Well, two things. First is don't subsidize other forms of energy. right? Don't subsidize burning of fossil fuels or anything else, because by doing that, you're wasting energy, you're killing or reducing the amount of energy that you can export, creating revenue for the nation. And the second is to avoid being stuck on traditional forms of power generation. We all have benefited from centralized generation in the past. There is new forms of energy, obviously, solar. And if we enable businesses to make the most competitive choice, they will be more competitive on a global basis.
Yeah, but at the same time, the competitive edge of the region has been based on the low cost of energy. So how do you maintain the competitive edge?
It absolutely is, right? But where does the value come? It doesn't come by burning the fuels here. It comes by selling them to somebody else, exporting them. That creates the revenue. So if we can reduce the consumption, we can export more, we can create more revenue.
Mr. Sheta, let us hear your point of view. So how can governments align their industrial policies with their decarbonization goals and maintain competitiveness?
So yeah, before I give a concrete example, I want to emphasize on the fact that we are physically exactly well positioned, generation, management of energy and consumption of clean energy, which gives you quite a good map about what can happen. Very concretely, institutions, government, ministers can decide on a regulation that pushes industries to decarbonize their operations also. So the generation of energy to be decarbonized, but also the usage of the energy to be optimized. And I want to give a very concrete example that is happening just in the UAE, where 1 year ago, the country launched an initiative called ITTI, which is Industrial Transformation towards Sustainability and Digitization. And they created an index that is the reflection of the SBTIs into the field of industries. With that, a company like Schneider and others were requested to do audits on digitization and sustainability of factories in the UAEs and to give the results to the government, and the government would subsidize by then the optimization to reduce the CO2 footprint of the said factories. There are many examples ongoing in the GCC countries, and I want to emphasize that it will not be one regulation that will solve it all, but multiple of these initiatives that will help us go to the target.
Mr. Yuan, where do you see the biggest opportunities for quick wins in industrial emissions reduction?
Well, I think, from energy generation to transition to applications, we all need transition from fossil fuel, traditional energy to renewable energy. Jerry mentioned distributed solar. That's also a big market in China as well. We have a portfolio that does that. So I think that's a great beginning. So from the generation, we need to shift from fossil fuel-based power generation to renewable energy generated. But to do that, it's not easy, right? It requires huge investment by the government as well as the private sector, as well as demand a sacrifice from consumers. In China, I think China is one of the major countries that had a very ambitious goal. President Xi has announced that we're going to have a dual carbon objective that's carbon peak by 2030, carbon neutrality by 2060. So that's a very, very ambitious goal. And to do that, I think the government, the state-owned companies, also private sectors are all doing their part. So for first half of this year, I think it's the first time in China that renewable energy installed capacity is more than 50% of the all power generation capacity. So I think that's a huge hallmark for China's energy development. And then also on the transmission and application side as well. So I'm focused on EV. I think for EV is a big application of power generation. I think that also needs to shift from, right now I think all the EV in China are still powered by fossil fuel power generation. That needs to shift to renewable energy as well. So we're looking at solutions that you have solar generated power, you have an energy solution, and energy storage solution, and that will charge into your EVs.
Let us talk about challenges. Mr. Crane, what do you think are the most significant barriers that industries face when it comes to implementing decarbonization strategies, and how can those barriers be overcome?
Look, I think you can't have change if you can't measure your impact. And I think one of the things I was discussing with some of our participants just over lunch now is the difficulty in quantifying the CO2 impact. And so when we think about wanting to decarbonize, well, where are we today? What is the carbon footprint of all of our inputs? It's easier to measure the carbon footprint of our transition, but I think that input and measurement is one of the biggest challenges that our customers are facing.
Mr. Sheta, when you think of challenges, we live in countries that are very high temperature countries. So in those regions, how can you balance cooling needs with the environmental goals?
Yeah, so sure. And you have to know that 35% of the energy emissions on the planet are done by buildings. So like the ones we live in and like the industries like infrastructures, buildings. And of course, to curb down the consumption of or the CO2 emissions, you need to reduce that consumption. You can do that by multiple ways of software and hardware that would make the cooling, in our case it's HVAC, more efficient. For example, Schneider launched in the GITEX just a few weeks ago a new chiller system that is not using water. By not using water, you reduce the consumption of energy of the chiller. As a consequence, you reduce the emissions of the said chiller. So technology can provide a lot of efficiency that goes up to 25 to 30% of the consumption of a building in which we are. So technology is one. Number two, and it's not a buzzword, AI can bring a lot. Because when you put big data about the functioning of a building like that one, you collect a lot of the habits of the people who are living and working in that building. As a consequence, you can make the HVAC behave in an optimized way depending on the occupancy, depending on whether it's a weekend or not. And again, you can save another 15%, up to 15% of the consumption. So my answer to that question would be simply technology can do a lot and digitization can do a lot in a concrete manner. It's already happening.
Where are we in the GCC from rolling out of such technologies and big data?
So, unlike one would think this is related to people, it's a people business because people who are collecting the data, people who are crunching the data, making them available and putting them into the machine learning, this competency is being built currently in the GCC because guess what? It needs huge data centers. The GCC is building state-of-the-art AI data centers as we speak. 1 gigawatt last year easily. I think more above 1.5 gigawatt dedicated to AI. So the machine is there. AI data centers needs a lot of fund and a lot of energy. So GCC is very well positioned for that to be the machine that will be solving the equation, at least in the field of building management system. So where is the GCC standing? I would say in the forefront, spearheading the movement in that regard.
On energy use of data centers, they also want to be, as you said, at the forefront when it comes to generating clean energy for the AIs, for the data centers that are required.
And I think there was a question about the fact that what would be the edge? The edge is the sun. So the GCC are full of sun like they used to be full of oil and gas. So we have the raw material to produce the clean energy, to produce green hydrogen, or to fuel green data centers.
Mr. Yuan, let's go back to the challenges. So what are the main challenges that for industries to adopt decarbonization strategies?
No, I think clearly one is the government initiatives. I think for any decarbonization or new energy, at first the costs are very high. So you need energy to put, you need government to put into certain incentives and subsidies to get the industry jump-started. I think that's how EV got started in China. That's how China is dominating EV right now. Secondly, I think it's infrastructure. to install solar, to install hydro, wind, you need a lot of infrastructure. Again, that's need combined efforts by the government as well as the private sector as well. I think thirdly, I think the consumer acceptance is also very, very important. We see, again, I think I'll keep going back to EV because that's my focus sector. In China, right now, over 50% of new car sales sold is all EVs because consumers accept that. But in Europe, in GCC, in US, it's still not the same story yet.
But let me make a segue. There is a slowdown in the sales of EVs everywhere, globally. How do you explain that?
Well, I think in Europe, there's clearly, I think, a backpedaling by government as well as a lot of major corporations in terms of rolling out EV.
Why?
I think it's the cost issue, there's the infrastructure issue, you don't have enough charging stations. I think European-made EVs are still more expensive. I think that's why you see first 9 months of this year, EV sales in Europe is actually less than last year. In North America, it's probably 10% growth. You see EVs probably in California, but very few in other states. I think, again, going back to consumer acceptance, a lot of traditional American consumers just not that acceptable to EV. But in China, it's still growing. I think last year we sold about over 7 million units. This past 9 months, we sold over 9 million units. So it's a 35% growth year over year, at a very, very large base. So, but again, with that large base, the growth is slowing down. It's not the acceptance, but the growth is slowing down. So I think that's why government's rolling out incentives to basically have trading incentives.
So you mentioned the cost of decarbonization. Let us talk about that. Mr. Crane, how can we ensure that this transition happens to cleaner industrial practices is financially viable for businesses of all sizes? Because as Mr. Yuan said, this needs government support and it's a costly process.
Well, it does. I would say that the government support to energy, to electricity specifically, has always been there. And I think we need to realize that the new forms of energy don't require that. And in fact, if governments got out of the way, the transition would happen. So today, our customers, depending a little bit on where they are saving 30 to 50% on their cost of generation by changing to clean energy. So the economics align with the transition to clean energy. There's no question. I think that the idea that there's a cost that's 10 years ago. That's not today.
Mr. Sheta, I have an EV, and my energy bill is lower than it should be. It's subsidized. Yeah. So my question is, to what extent is this needed? I mean, to what extent do you need financial mechanisms in place and incentives to this? I'm talking on the as an individual, but when you are talking about industry, to what extent do you think there is a need for that?
So, yeah, as Jeremy said, in fact, in reality, it's not needed anymore for an industry to transition toward clean energy and energy efficiency, very important component of the overall transition. It's the payback, the ROI now is sometimes less than a year. So for an industrial business captain, for a hotel owner, in fact, it's a very good investment because you get your ROI in 1 year and after that it's all benefit. So what is the reason why we don't accelerate this transition? It's not because of lack of subsidies. We don't need subsidies. I believe in some cases it's just the front investment that you need to do. And this is why companies come there to transform this CapEx into OpEx. And many, many companies now are entering that field. If you have a company that will hold the CapEx and sell to you that as a CapEx, there is no border anymore. And I'm very positive. I'm very positive. I think in the GCC it will go very fast because things go faster here than in Europe.
Mr. Yuan, if we forget about incentives and we talk about the investments that need to go into this transition, to what extent do you think is financing available, or is it a barrier for the required energy transition?
I think we need to look at different asset classes. I think for infrastructure, for asset-heavy companies, I think a lot of those investments are very suitable for insurance companies because these are very stable cash flow, very safe. So for example, I think I mentioned to Jeremy, we invested in a distributed solar company in China, and they actually sold their assets to an insurance company so they can be more asset light and generate more returns for investors like us. And then on the other hand, I think for new and innovative technologies, VCs and PEs are still very active because they view, I think energy transition and renewable energy as the next big thing, probably outside of AI. So I think that's still very attractive investment opportunity in that. I just used 2 examples.
When we look at capital allocation, what are the most recipient sectors in that space, Mr. Yuan? Where is the capital mostly allocated to now when it comes to financing the energy transition?
Yeah, I think my background's in China, so I'll probably use China as an example. I think if you look at the last 5 to 10 years, majority investments goes into EV. I think on OEMs, battery companies, LiDARs, chips, I think that's probably the most of it. I think renewable energy, whether it's solar, wind, that was probably down 15, 20, almost 20 years ago. So I think last 5 to 10 years, clearly it's EV related.
Let us talk about the role of technology. Mr. Crane, you mentioned solar, but if we look ahead to 2030, which do you think emerging technologies hold the most promise for industrial emissions reduction?
Well, look, I'd like to just start actually by adding to what Mr. Yuan just said. We see continued evolution in solar year over year, but it's incremental, right? It's 5-10%. So every year the technology gets a little bit better, a little bit more efficient, a little bit more cost effective. So that 10 years ago when we were founded, we were saving people 5%, and now we're saving them 50%. Where is that going to go? What is the next frontier? For my perspective, it's solidly storage. Storage is what's going to enable the generation that solar does during the daytime to become a 12, 18, 24-hour source of power. And so a factory today or a shopping mall or whatever the asset is that needs energy, it is generating during the daytime, it's using during the daytime. As cost of storage is plummeting, benefiting EVs, it's also benefiting generation because now we can generate more and use it throughout the nighttime.
Mr. Sheta, you mentioned technology when it comes to cooling, but if we take a broader look at the decarbonizing industry in general, which technologies are you most excited about?
Well, not one necessarily, but many broad examples. For example, we have recently worked with Ducab, which is the Dubai cable company. And in that case, the extraction of the cables themselves, if you electrify that process, you reduce your energy consumption by 15% approximately. So in that very specific case, electrification in a broadband is reducing your bill in general instead of increasing it. You used your personal example of a personal electric car versus a combustion car. It's the same for industries. The more you electrify your process, whatever process it is, the better it will be both for your wallet and both for the CO2 emission. So I think the key word, except in very few industries, the key word is electrification of your processes. It will help you reduce by far the consumption.
Mr. Yuan, I don't know if you want to discuss that, if you want to give us your thoughts on which technology looks most promising going forward, but I also want to stop at not technology, but at hydrogen, because this is the buzzword these days, that this is the next big thing when it comes to decarbonization. But we have not seen yet the applications of that. There is a lot of excitement into the production, but we have not seen yet the applications of hydrogen. So how do you see that happening? In what time horizon as well?
Yeah. Well, the last question is very difficult to answer in terms of time horizon. Yeah, I was going to say the two technology we are monitoring closely, one is hydrogen, second is nuclear fusion. Hydrogen, I think, is actually a proven technology. I think in Japan, Toyota has developed very mature technology, but unfortunately, it just hasn't been widely adopted globally. I think it has to do with its cost issue. It's very costly to refine it, transport it, store it. So the cost is an issue. And secondly, the process itself is also very energy intensive. So there's controversy over, yes, it's clean energy. When you burn it, it just vaporizes into water. But the process itself is also energy intensive. So that's something we're monitoring. As I mentioned, EV penetration in China is already 50%. It's very difficult to get higher than that if no new technologies come into play. We think that hydrogen could potentially solve the long distance travel, especially for heavy duty trucks. Passenger cars within city, I think EVs are fine. I think most Chinese EVs has, battery that can drive you 500, 600 kilometers with no issues. But the drive intercity, especially with heavy duty trucks, it becomes very challenging because the battery itself is going to be very, very heavy and not safe. So hydrogen could be a potential solution. But again, just going back to my point, I think I agree with traditional renewable energy, solar, we don't need incentive subsidy anymore, but for hydrogen, I think we do. To jumpstart the industry, you do need some government incentives. I'm very pleased to see Europe, especially Germany, is rolling out incentive for hydrogen. I think some Asian countries like Singapore as well. In China, also at a limited scale. Because, I guess unlike 10 years ago, China's not flooded with money right now. The other key technology is nuclear fusion. I think that's proven in labs, but to have it commercialized at a cost that's competitive, maybe still a long way to go. But
But now we are hearing that Amazon and Google are making deals when it comes to small nuclear reactors for the data centers. It seems that it's the next big thing happening there.
It is. I think there are several startups in China that already got funding. We are closely monitoring that. I think when the cost comes down, it will be real.
Does anyone have a comment on? I see that you have your microphone.
Yeah, in fact, you still there is the elephant in the room is that you will always still need a base load. So you can use solar, you can use alternative energies up to a limit. You will still need a base load, and of course, it's nuclear. It will remain to be nuclear to be the decarbonized energy of the future. Nuclear plus renewable energies can provide the most efficient of energies, which is electrical energy. The electrical motor is the most efficient one compared to hydrogen, compared to combustion, compared to anything else.
Mr. Craig, you have a comment?
Sure. I'm going to be maybe a little bit contrarian to a few views. I don't see hydrogen playing a big part of our future energy. The cost of transport, the cost of generation and then use is very high. It is definitely good to electrify our processes, and where hydrogen is needed in a process, as we know it is in some places, great. Electrify it, produce it. I don't see it as being a big fuel of the future or a molecule that's going to replace the carbon atom. And I think that your point about data centers is a really interesting one, but that's actually nuclear fission, right? We're seeing a repowering of fission. I think fusion is great. I think I completely agree it's a few years out. Maybe in the next decade, within the decade, we'll see it becoming viable. That would be fantastic. But I think that, in fact, the base load will be in this decade for many businesses. My view is solar and batteries will be the base load, and we'll be using natural gas or diesel for the emergency, for that 10-20% when it's been cloudy for a few days or there's a storm. You need that, there's no question. But in this decade, we'll see solar plus batteries being the most economical solution for 80% of a business's needs.
Let us take, if anyone has a question, please give me a sign. Unless, if there are no questions, we can continue with our conversation. No questions from the audience? Can we pass on a microphone? Yes, please. Tell us who is it addressed to.
Hi. Thank you for the great session. The question is addressed to any of the gentlemen. Feel free to answer. I would like to ask about the electrical vehicles. How much I am doing a favor to the environment by using electrical vehicle, but powered by electricity that is based solely on burning fuels. So I know that currently this is not the perfect model, but am I doing a favor by having an electrical vehicle, or it is still much better than the traditional car? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I said EV right now is an interim solution. It's definitely not the ultimate solution. As you rightly point out, most of the EVs now are powered by fossil-generated energy. On the one hand, I think it's a step towards the right direction. So I think power generation, even using natural gas or even mostly coal in China, you do it in a centralized place, you do it more efficiently. There's, carbon capturing, there's, waste air treatment. That's more efficient to have hundreds and thousands of cars in major cities burning gas. A lot of times they're, more than 10 years, the cars are more than 10 years old, they're just not very efficient. So I think there's some efficiency saving in terms of energy consumption. But I think the ultimate step, which is the main topic here, is having power generation transition from fossil oil to renewable oil. So if we can have EV cars powered by solar-generated power, then we have them stored, then we have them charged when needed, I think that's the ultimate solution.
Let me ask you the same question to all of you. If we look at global successful examples for decarbonization, what lessons can be learned from some of the successful industrial decarbonization projects globally? Mr. Crane.
Well, there's so many to choose from. Look, I started my career in wind power in Costa Rica. It's a country which runs 364 days a year on clean energy. How do they do that? They have a mixture of solar plus wind plus hydro, and they're able to bridge all of those through a cogeneration model where they store the hydro and when it's windy and when it's sunny. Now, obviously in the Middle East, we don't have a hydro resource normally, so we need to be a little bit more innovative, and I think that's where the storage comes in. So what we're seeing today, and actually just last month, we took a large agricultural area in South Africa, just north of Pretoria, off-grid. We built a 13-kilometer grid. We've connected it to a solar battery and diesel backup, and the whole area is now being powered. So there's agriculture, not everyone realizes, is actually one of the dirtiest industries, right? From fertilizers to waste products to all of the energy they build to move things around. We've completely taken this agricultural zone to a clean energy generation. Now, 88% of their power on a 365 basis will come from clean energy.
Mr. Sheta.
I was thinking of an example that we executed near Michigan, and in fact, it was, when I think about it, it was about microgrid. This is where it was a connected microgrid, but it was contained. So it was a county with the bus stations, with the electrical buses, with solar energy. So we could realize, using our softwares, the exact CO2 footprint of the city. And we can demonstrate it to the citizens, to the taxpayers. So I think that what we learn, to answer your question, what we learn from the experiences that are successful is that it's good to start small. Small meaning the scale of a small city, a factory, an estate where you can measure, control, modify, and make sure that your equation is tallying. I think it works fine, and it works even faster than bigger scales.
Yeah, I'm actually going to use distributed PV. I think many sustainability conscious companies are changing their company headquarters into, exemplary projects like that. So they will install solar panels on the roof. They will have energy storage facilities to store those energy, and then at the peak time they will use it, or they can sell back to the grid. Again, using EV example, we are now seeing a lot of charging companies doing that. So they have solar panels on top, and then store the energy, and when the cars come to charge, they can release that. I think all these are small steps, but I think there's small steps toward the right direction.
There are two ideas which I think we haven't discussed yet. One is the carbon credits market, and the second is decarbonizing the whole value chain, because it doesn't make sense that you decarbonize industry and then along the chain you have mining or you have... So how do you go about doing that as a policy? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, let me focus on the full value chain, because I think that's super critical. Our business started 10 years ago on the consumer products. First project we built with Unilever. They were market leaders. They wanted to sell clean shampoo. As the cost benefits have increased, we've seen the transition moving upstream. To today, we're doing a lot of work in South Africa with mines, where the mines want to change. So now from the mines to the logistics sector to the transforming companies to the final products, they're all going clean. It's economical for them all to do it. And I think if there's a part of that value chain that's being missed, we need to focus, we need to go after those and tell those people they can change, they can save money, they can be more competitive.
Yeah.
I think the UAE created an emission trading platform. So if your industry doesn't enable you to be climate positive or carbon negative, you can go on that platform, and other industries that can create, because of their size, because of the size of their land, they can become, in fact, carbon negative, like what it means that they, in fact, absorb more carbon than what they emit, and they can trade it. It exists. It's happening in the GCC. I think it's a good solution. It exists already. We need to advertise it
I think
more.
it's a voluntary market so far,
Yes.
and I think it's GCC platform. I think
Exactly.
that many countries are contributing to it so far.
Absolutely. It's a quite concrete answer to the question. If you are willing to really measure your net zero, I would say, target.
Do we have any other questions from the audience before we wrap it up? We have, can we pass on a microphone, please?
Ali Al-Baqqali, Alba CEO. Actually, I am having different opinion than the panelists in terms of two things. One is the base load. They said it will be from solar. I disagree on this, because the base load should come from the natural gas or from the reliable source of energy, because now the solar energy is not stable, and you cannot, especially for heavy industry, you cannot depend totally on the solar energy. This is one thing. I think it should be opposite. 80% or 60% should be the base load from the natural gas or from the conventional energy, and 40 to 30% should be from the solar. Also, should not forget that the incentive also should be very important for to decarbonize the heavy industry. If you look at two things now, if you look at Europe, they're penalizing the industry by imposing the CBAM carbon tax. But on the other hand, if you look at the USA, they are encouraging or incentivizing the industry in order to do or to go for green energy. I think this is the only I want to
Does anyone have a comment on that? Jeremy?
Well, Mr. Ali, I wouldn't want to argue with you in front of all these fantastic people, but I think that solar on its own, I'll agree with you, absolutely. You can't rely on it exclusively. But solar with storage is a baseload. And we've got some very sophisticated models that we could sit down and go through and show you how reliable that is. But today, I do not encourage you to disconnect from the grid. That is not my argument. I think grid power is very necessary for heavy industries. Certainly the space available in Bahrain limits the capacity that you can put in 100%. I think a partnership between investors and developers and industry, we can overcome that and we can recognize fantastic economic savings.
Let us wrap it up by a final comment from Mr. Sheta and Mr. Yuan. Today we are talking about the need to reduce carbon emissions, but also the world is facing global energy needs that are increasing. So how do you see this paradox going forward, Mr. Sheta?
So we call it the trilemma of energy. So on one side, we have to curb down the emissions of CO2. On the other side, we want all a sustainable economical development for our communities. And number three, everyone is looking now to secure its sources of energy in a world full of geopolitical tension. So this trilemma, seen by me, is the unique opportunity to go to the transition, to migrate, to accelerate the movement of sustainability and not to decelerate it. We've been talking about the fact that the ROI is short. We've been talking that it is good for your economical balance sheet. So it pushes us to accelerate on that movement rather than to slow it down.
Mr. Yuan, some final remarks.
Just to add on that, I think GCC can play a great role in that. I think China's leading in new energy and EV, but US and European Union are putting up tariffs to stop Chinese products from going into those markets. But I think GCC does have a huge advantage as viewed as a neutral region. It has free trade agreements with a lot of major markets. I think with Chinese technology, manufacturing capability, together with GCC's openness and collaboration, we see a bright future for energy transition.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for this conversation. And to the audience, thank you very much for bearing with us. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.